Warning: this podcast contains graphic descriptions that could be disturbing to some. Please use discretion when listening.
Well, good afternoon. We promised that the day would come when arrests would be made in the Pike County massacres. Today is that day.
By the time the Wagner family was arrested, 2.5 years after the murders of 8 members of the Rhoden family, Mike DeWine was no longer just Ohio's Attorney General. He was Ohio's soon-to-be governor, freshly elected, but not yet inaugurated into the role. On November 13th, 2018, 1 week after Election Day, DeWine called a press conference where we learned a lot more about the suspected motive and methods behind the murders of the Rhoden family. I'm WCPO9 digital journalist Felicia Jordan, and this is While They Were Sleeping, the Pike County Murders. The day of the press conference, DeWine and Pike County Sheriff Charles Reeder announced that 6 people, Billy Wagner, his wife Angela, their 2 sons, George and Jake, and Billy and Angela's mothers, had been arrested in connection with the murders. I remember watching as our sister station in Lexington, Kentucky, shared with us footage of Lexington officers handcuffing Billy Wagner nearly 3 hours from where the murders happened, while a horse trailer bearing the Flying W Farm logo was parked nearby. Former WCPO anchor Evan Millward got on the road as quickly as possible.
I want to say we got tipped off that something was going on, whether it was a source told us or just because of how public it was. So we got a heads up. We have a station in Lexington, WLEX. We called them because there was no way we were getting to this scene outside Lexington in time to see anything. They got to the scene very quickly. So we had video of this goofy operation happening because you wouldn't know it was anything other than like maybe a really big traffic stop if you didn't know. The next day, we know Billy's going to be in court. We've got to be there. So went down to downtown Lexington to the courthouse there. We go to court, and this was the first time we ever had a chance to see any of these people in the flesh, like in the wild, in real life. I'm 6'5". Billy is 6'5" and probably 100 pounds on me. Like, he's my height, and he's bigger. He's just a presence of a guy, and he seems so annoyed by this whole thing.
Billy's wife, Angela, and their 2 sons, George and Jake, were arrested in Ohio at the same time. But 2 other people were also arrested. Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, and Billy's mother, Frederica Wagner. They were charged with lying to officers, obstructing justice, and forgery. It looked like a full family affair. At a press conference later in the day, DeWine revealed some of the evidence BCI had against the Wagners. He said they had proof that before the murders, the Wagners bought ammo, a magazine clip, brass catchers, and a surveillance bug detector to prepare for the crimes.
We believe that the Wagners conspired together to develop an elaborate plan to kill the 8 victims under the cover of darkness and then carefully cover up their tracks. We believe the evidence will show that the suspects spent months planning the crimes. They studied the victims' habits and their routines. They knew the layouts of their homes. They knew where they slept.
But why? What could possibly drive an entire family to spend months planning the murders of 8 people? Well, DeWine said, in addition to murder, the family was also charged with forgery because BCI discovered they'd apparently forged custody documents.
Now, because this is an open prosecution, we won't be able to say much about motive, but you'll see from the indictments that custody of that young child plays a role in this case.
In the end, that's what it was: custody. A feud between Jake Wagner and Hannah Mae over the child they shared together had apparently grown so bitter that Jake, his brother, and both of his parents decided to turn to murder. That child was just 2 years old when her mother was murdered.
Yeah, again, we have to be careful what we say, but there certainly was obsession with custody, obsession with control of children. I just might tell you this is just the most bizarre story I've ever seen in being involved in law enforcement. I mean, when the entire story, as it will unfold at trial, it is just, it's just amazing.
DeWine and Sheriff Reeder repeatedly said at the press conference that they couldn't speak in any detail about what led them to the Wagners. But DeWine said there was no evidence anyone else was involved. They'd finally gotten their suspects. But the path to trial had just begun. And again, it meant a grueling wait for justice for the remaining members of the Rhoden family. The initial hearings were wrapped up by the end of 2018. All of the Wagners pleaded not guilty in court, but all were held in jail without bond. They would sit in jail for years while the justice system ran its course. From there, information about the murders, the investigation, and what happened the night of April 21st, 2016 was scarce as officials prepared for trials. But still, the years that followed brought unexpected updates in a case that kept us all on our toes. 1 month after the Wagner arrests, Sheriff Reeder himself was arrested, accused of misconduct. In the end, none of his crimes were tied to the Rhoden murders, but he apparently stole money that had been confiscated as evidence in other cases. In the end, he was barred from ever being a police officer again and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Another twist happened in June of 2019, when the charges against Frederica Wagner, Billy's mother, were dropped. She'd been accused of helping cover up the crimes, but she was able to produce receipts that showed she hadn't lied to investigators. She just made a mistake when she spoke with them. The other grandmother charged, Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, took a plea deal in December of 2019. Court hearings and motion arguments carried on from there, with little to no movement in the case. Then, in 2020, court proceedings ground to a halt, a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the biggest surprise of all happened on April 22nd, 2021, exactly 5 years after the murders. Jake Wagner changed his plea.
So we're almost entirely all still work from home. It's the 5th anniversary. We're talking about what to do. Do we go out there? And I got a tip that said, you need to be in Pike County, go check the docket. And there was a plea hearing that had been dropped on the docket that morning, maybe the night before, but probably that morning for Jake Wagner. And I have never moved faster in my professional career. In fact, got a speeding ticket On the way to Waverly, so did Eric Clay, just the photographer. We were booking it to get out there because we didn't have that much heads up. And we knew we needed, like, you're like, okay, this is the break in the case. But it was a shock.
Jake Wagner agreed to plead guilty to all counts, including unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, because Hannah was 15 years old when she got pregnant, while Jake was 20. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to drop the death penalty against him and the rest of his family members. He only had to testify against them at trial. Angela followed suit in September of 2021, agreeing to the same deal. But unlike Jake, who would spend the rest of his life in jail, Angela's deal allowed for her release after 30 years. But, like Mike DeWine had said, it wasn't until Jake's brother, George, went to trial in September of 2022 that we'd learn the whole story behind the Pike County murders.
Okay, let's talk about why we are here. We are here, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, because this defendant, George Wagner IV, aka George Wagner, and his brother, Edward Jacob Wagner, and his father, George Wagner III, also known as Billy Wagner. The three of them, in the late hours of April 21st of 2016 into the early morning hours of April 22nd of 2016, went up to Union Hill Road to 3 different locations that you all saw, and 1 location out on Left Fork Road, and murdered 8 people who did not deserve to die.
George Wagner's trial lasted 3 whole months. In that time, prosecutors brought out all the evidence they'd gathered against the Wagner family in the 6 years since the murders. I covered the trial from start to finish, along with my TV counterpart, Evan Millward. He was there for opening statements, which lasted a full 2 days.
The sense I got in that room was that people understood that we were in this for a long haul. I don't think anyone really understood that we were in it for such a long haul, that it was going to be this just like months and months and months and months and months. But people were hoping for the quick overview and here's how we're going to nail them on it. And then the defense to come in and be like, and here's how we're going to redirect and shoot it down. And what they got instead was this like marathon opening statement where we learned a lot and yet not really. To me, at least, it felt like this mixture of we're finally here. This is the start of the thing that we have to do to get the justice through the system that is the system. And there's some anticipation there, but I think everyone also understood we're now years after this happened and we're just about to rip the scab right off. And it's about to be really hard again.
Opening statements were led on the prosecution's side by Special Prosecutor Angela Canepa. She painted a picture for the jury of a family who conspired together for months before some of them crept into the 4 Rhoden homes under the cover of darkness to horribly murder 8 people. One piece of evidence highlighted heavily throughout the trial was a conversation between Hannah Mae and the mother of George's ex-wife, Tabitha, just 4 months before the murders. The pair were discussing the different custody battles with the Wagner sons, and Tabitha's mother told Hannah Mae not to sign anything, like her daughter had. Hannah Mae responded, quote, "I won't sign papers ever. It won't happen. They will have to kill me first." End quote. Investigators found a screenshot of that message on a computer belonging to the Wagners. A screenshot Angela took while hacked into Tabitha's mother's Facebook account. moments after the message was sent.
And I have to say, note, probably the most important word in that is she says, I won't sign papers ever. They will have to kill me first. Not Jake will have to kill me first. They will have to kill me first. Because she knew how the Wagners operated. She talked about the fact of how they did Tabitha that night and how they were trying to lure her back into the house. And they had a gun on the coffee table. So she very much understood how the Wagners operated as a group.
Special Agent Ryan Scheiterer with BCI testified that the Wagners weren't identified as people of interest in the murders until they read that message from Hannah.
Once we started seeing the background of our victims, with specifically Hannah Rhoden, there was concerns in there that there was some potential custody issues that was in the Facebook records themselves, and that is not what had been reported to us when we first made contact with Jake Wagner. He had indicated that everything was okay, that he had a good relationship with Hannah, and there was no issues involving their child that they shared together. So that was a little suspicious. It warranted a little further investigation, obviously.
Scheiterer said 1 year after the murders, BCI agents visited the Wagner home on Peterson Road and spoke to Jake. Jake told them the Wagners had sold the farm, and new owners would take over the property on May 10th. BCI agents later returned and found the Wagners packing trucks and trailers with their belongings. It was then the Wagners told Scheiterer they were moving to Alaska.
During that time, did you observe anything in the driveway that was of interest to you?
Yes, while speaking with Angela and Jake, they were willing to speak with us. They didn't ask us to leave. I just casually observed there was numerous fired cartridge casings lying about the driveway all over the place. There was hundreds, if not thousands, of cartridges laying around.
This was the jackpot for BCI. They'd already collected some shell casings from the murder scenes. Those casings and the bullets recovered from crime scenes and murder victims were examined by BCI firearms examiner Matt White. White said they had found bullets from 3 different guns. A .30 caliber high-powered round, likely shot from an SKS rifle. .40 caliber bullets, likely fired from a Glock pistol, and multiple .22 caliber bullets. But the .22 cartridges found at the crime scenes were the most telling. The cartridge showed a strange impression from the gun's firing pin, the part of a gun that strikes a bullet cartridge to fire it.
During my examination, I noticed the shape of the firing pin impression is unusual. Typically, the firing pin impression on rimfire evidence is either rectangular or circular. Those are by far the most common that are encountered. If you'll notice the general shape of this firing pin impression, it seems rectangular for about half of it, and then it wedges outward in appearance, giving it an unusual shape, or definitely not a very common shape. I've never encountered a firing pin impression on a .22 fired cartridge case that looks like that before.
After reaching out to other firearm experts, White ultimately figured out that the gun the cartridge came from was a Walther Colt 1911 pistol. This was the type of gun that killed Frankie and Hazel at the second crime scene, and Dana, Chris Jr., and Hannah Mae at the third crime scene. While White was working on ballistic evidence, Bill Bodziak was one of 2 experts asked to examine the bloody shoe prints BCI had collected from Chris Sr.'s kitchen. Bodziak has testified as a shoe print expert in other trials, including the O.J. Simpson trial and the trial of Timothy McVeigh. BCI agents had already determined the shoes that made those bloody prints were made by 2 cheap pairs of Walmart shoes with Velcro fasteners, size 11 and size 10.5. After the Wagners left for Alaska, BCI almost immediately executed a search warrant at the home on Peterson Road. In the trash, agents found printouts of Facebook chats. They also found some shell casings and unfired .22 caliber rounds throughout the house and in outbuildings on the property. Outside, BCI agents and law enforcement combed the property in a grid formation. They discovered hundreds of shell casings, including casings from a rim-fire .22 caliber pistol, similar to the unique casings found at 2 of the crime scenes. Several of the .22 cartridges found on the Wagner property had the same unusual firing pin impression as the cartridges found at the murder scenes. Agent White testified that, after making microscopic comparisons of the two, it was his opinion the shell casings were all fired from the same weapon. Inside a barn on the property, investigators found an old well. It was covered with debris, and bricks had been placed inside to try to fill it in. But BCI agent Brian White said they couldn't search the well that day.
Once we looked at it and we decided that it'd be best to have a dive team go down and search it. It wasn't that big, it was just deep. And we didn't have equipment available to us at BCI to be able to safely go in to the cistern and do it. So our plan was to get a hold of a dive team at a later date and have a dive team come in and search it.
When they were able to search inside, the dive team recovered the remains of an illegal homemade silencer. Forensic accountants tracking the Wagner's purchases quickly found that in the months leading up to the murders, Jake had bought everything he'd needed to make it. It had been used, but it had failed. Jake would later testify they'd used fuel filters as silencers instead, after the design of the one found in the well didn't work. During the 2-day execution of the search warrant, investigators also went to another property where the Wagners had parked multiple trailers and vehicles filled with their belongings before they left for Alaska. It took them hours to unpack and search everything crammed into those trailers. But in the end, they found some of the most crucial evidence tying the Wagner family to the Rhoden murders. In particular, they found custody documents. One page, a declaration of custody for a child in the event of a parent's death, appeared to have been signed by Hannah Rhoden. It designated Jake as the custodian for their child in the event of her death. Angela Wagner later confessed to forging that signature. The signature was dated December 25th, 2014. But on the bottom corner of the printout, investigators noticed something odd.
Particularly of interest when I uncovered this form was at the bottom, there is a URL that says http with the colon, 2 forward slashes, and then a website, texasprobate.net/forms/dgminor.htm, and there's a date on the bottom right corner that lists April 3rd, 2016.
The date indicated when the document was printed, just weeks before the murders. 2 other documents named Angela Wagner as the sole custodian of Jake and George's children if either brother died, not the children's mothers. In the trailers, investigators found more copies of private Facebook messages and copies of George's ex-wife's Social Security card and driver's license. Then, BCI agent Julia Ebeslage found a Walmart receipt among Angela's many meticulous records.
Can you tell us why you felt that that item was important?
Going into the search warrant, we had specific items that we were thinking of. Particularly of interest, we knew of the Walmart shoe at the time of the search warrant. So we were certainly looking for anything to do with Walmart, anything to do with cell phones, and the obvious, guns, ammunition, things like that. So that was one of my missions, was to look specifically for anything regarding purchases at Walmart.
BCI agents had already tracked down surveillance footage of Angela leaving the Waverly Walmart with a cart full of purchased items. That footage was captured around 2 weeks before the murders, on April 7th, 2016. They also found an order to conduct a genetic paternity test for Hannah Mae's infant, the baby found in her bed next to her body. It was filed in June, after the homicides. The paternity test determined what Hannah and other Rhodens had said all along. Jake had no genetic relationship with the baby. By the time of George's trial, investigators had cell phone records that showed suspicious movements by the Wagners the day before the murders. They had evidence the Wagners were surveilling the women in George and Jake's lives by logging into their Facebook accounts without their knowing. They had text messages between the Wagners in which they talked about buying parts for the silencer that was found in the well. At this point in the investigation, BCI was sure that the Wagners were involved in the Rhoden murders. So, they devised a plan to get each of the Wagners into separate interview rooms at the same time for questioning. Unbeknownst to the Wagners, BCI had already been in touch with U.S. Border Patrol, who'd been tracking them during their time in Alaska. When the Wagners made their next trip south from Alaska, Border Patrol alerted BCI when they declared their intent to cross at the Canadian border with Montana. By the time the Wagners got there, BCI agents were waiting. They interviewed each member of the family and zeroed in on Angela Wagner and those Walmart shoes.
I don't know. Are you telling me those are the shoes that was used in the murder?
Yep.
I don't.
Somebody wearing those shoes stepped in the blood of either Chris or Gary or whomever and left the shoe impression, the tread impression. We matched it with our lab database. So we know it came from those particular shoes that you bought less than 2.5 weeks prior to the murders.
I do not think that they could be those.
They are. Our lab matched them.
They're an identical match.
Identical size to what the shoe tread was at the crime scene to the size shoe that you bought at Walmart.
We're just trying to figure it out.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I got them, but I don't. They are an old man's shoe, so they wouldn't wear them. But they wouldn't have used them on those because I threw them away.
For what away?
So you remember buying them?
Yeah, I mean, I do, but because I remember they wanted some shoes.
You threw them away?
But they're, an old man's shoe, and they wouldn't wear them, but I don't know how they could be the exact ones.
Why would you buy them if you don't think they would wear them?
No, I said they wouldn't afterwards.
Okay.
After what?
They saw them.
After they saw them?
Old man's shoes.
You did look at them and say, wait.
Papa wears those.
So you do remember buying them and you do remember throwing them away?
Yeah.
But where were those shoes? And the guns used to commit the murders? And who had pulled the triggers? Next week, we'll recount what Jake and Angela say happened that night. This is While They Were Sleeping, the Pike County Murders.